Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our NEWAVE e-lecture series on water governance theoretical perspectives. Today with us, we have Professor Aaron Wolf for our grand finale. This is our last event in our series. And I'm extremely happy and honored to be able to introduce Professor Aaron Wolf, which needs no introductions, really. He's Professor of Geography in the College of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. Professor Wolf is the most well-known and cited author in the field of transboundary water conflicts and cooperation. He developed and coordinates the transboundary freshwater dispute database, which is really a terms of reference for everybody in our hydropolitical field. And in addition to being a leading scholar, Professor Wolf is also a trained mediator. And as such, he directs the program in water conflict management and transformation. Professor Wolf has contributed to numerous international and transboundary strategies, programs, and partnerships for several years on river basins around the world, including the Mekong, the Jordan, and other rivers in Central Asia. Finally, Professor Wolf is an active member of NEWAVE, and as such, he supervises one of our PhD students. Professor Wolf, I'm very honored to have you here with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jean-Paul. And let me just start by thanking you and Katrina for all the work you've done on this series. It's a little early for me here on the West Coast, so I haven't made as many as I like, but it's a real pleasure to see this particular group coming together. And I love this structure of interaction. So really quickly, I know you guys have done a lot of this before. The problem in shared waters is that they're shared. Water people tend to see the world the way it looks on this map on the left, where all we see are watersheds. Everything's connected to everything else. We see the connections, we see the relationships. Unfortunately, the real world is divided up by nice straight lines that emphasize the separations, the differences between us. And so there are a number of basins that have made headlines over the years, certainly the Jordan, the Nile, the Indus as kind of basins at risk that people have watched for potential hydropolitical tensions. But it's worth remembering that there are some 310 transboundary waters. So the 6 that are tense in any given moment aren't really representative. It's half the land surface of the earth. 2/3 of water originates in basins that are shared by 2 or more countries. And that's not even talking about the 600 some transboundary aquifers. So it's a vast area. And a lot of people have really kind of focused at this large scale, the big data problems. This is the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago noticed that all of their big crises that the Earth is facing, the big ones are all water related, either the water crisis by name or natural disasters, climate change and mitigation, and so on. And a lot of security type folks around the world, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, in the US, the Dutch, the Swiss, the Swedes, have certainly thought about the relationship between kind of the high political and high security issues and water resources, and now most recently around climate change. So there's a lot of really interesting work going on at the kind of big, large end studies, doing early warning work and doing conflict prevention work. And certainly we're involved in a lot of these, trying to identify the basins that'll be at risk in the next 3 to 5 years, so the work can be done to make sure those conflicts don't escalate. That's not at all what I wanted to talk about this afternoon. My experience, as Jean-Paul in his extremely kind introduction pointed out, about half my time is spent in the room as a facilitator, a resource person, or a mediator. And so a lot of my studies have particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, really started to emphasize also this scale of interaction. I was trained originally as a groundwater person. I was trained as a scientist, and only by getting involved in processes did I understand that these also are topics that need to be studied and need to be learned as as a skill set. I would be faced with a room full of angry people around an aquifer in Wisconsin. And I would say, I'd go off and I'd do the calculations, and I'd come into the room and I'd say, you don't have to be angry anymore. I figured out the answer. And that only made them angrier. Of course, it's not about the answer, it's about the process. And so I had to go back to school to start to learn process. And I, like a lot of people, initially was exposed to what's called alternative dispute resolution, which is a very structured, very rational approach to conflict, very systematic, and it's almost an optimization exercise that the thinking is, if you can show the benefits of cooperation, it's a rational decision to decide to cooperate. But if it's so rational, why isn't there more of it? And the more I started to practice, the more I started to understand that processes were often moved by what I could only think of as moments of transformation, when suddenly the room shifts. It's not a rational, orderly process, but rather somebody listens to somebody else, or somebody compliments somebody else, or somebody asks a telling question of somebody else. And it's instantly contagious. Suddenly the room shifts and people are willing to problem solve, and people are willing to, and these moments of transformation are not something that I came across in any of my studies. And I was working at one point with a wonderful scholar and practitioner, Vahida Levian, who's passed away since, who was at the World Bank at the time. I said, where do we see this transformative moments in the real world? And I didn't know, because we don't often talk about it in the West, but he was a deep believer, a Baha'i practitioner. And he said, you know, it looks a little bit like spiritual transformation. He says, isn't this what faith traditions try and get you to do, is to, you're there with your borders and your wants and your needs, to take the borders off of your map and recognize the relationships between other people, and if it's in your language, with the divine. So of course I'm a Western scientist, and all my red flags go up, and no, we don't talk about these things, I'm not interested. But he then made a proposal that was just too compelling. He said, why don't you find out from the faith traditions, from the indigenous communities, what are the tools that they use in our settings, and see if there aren't some constructs or some methods that you might be able to bring back to help us do our work better. So again, I'm sorry, I'm a Western land grant public university. We don't do that. But then as a scientist, the proposal was just too compelling. And so this launched me off on the most recent direction of research and practice, which was to ask exactly that. And the first place we did this was Peter Glick at the Pacific Institute and Oregon State University, and the Vatican Science Council. We had this meeting in Vatican City where we brought together people who had negotiated water agreements at a very high level, and leaders from different faith traditions from around the world, and asked those kinds of questions. Is there something our two communities can learn from each other? And if I'm honest, the meeting did not go well at all. We got very few answers because the languages were just too different. What I hadn't recognized at the time is in our kind of Western construct, in the Enlightenment, we separated the worlds of rationality and spirituality consciously for very legitimate reasons. And we said in public discourse, you can say what you want, talk about whatever you want, as long as it's quantifiable, as long as it's measurable. You can have this other religious or spiritual world, but it's at home in your Friday, Saturday, or Sunday community, but don't bring those two together. And after 200 years of that, folks on the West, we would have a water minister talking about biogeofluvial something or other, and next to him there's a Sufi mystic who's just exuding positive energy, almost visible light, and he never said a word, but you just wanted to sit next to him because the energy was so moving. So these languages didn't offer many answers, but did set me off on a quest literally around the world. to sit with Buddhist monks in Thailand or with Kabbalists in Jerusalem to try to understand. And the result is the book that this lecture is named after that came out in 2017. And I just want to assure this is written for practitioners, people who do process or who are involved in conflicts, whether they're water related or not. These are the lessons that I found. So let me just give a quick touch of what some of the things that that I thought were useful from a practitioner's perspective. One of the first is this idea of 4 basic needs. This is something that if you think about, a lot of us are having very difficult political conversations recently. And if you think about talking to somebody who has very different political views than you do, and you think about the very, very first moments when they start to express something that you vehemently disagree with, you imagine a physical response. Your body tightens up, your pulse may go up, your eyes may dilate, the hair on the back of your neck stands up. And this is classic fight or flight or freeze. It's a biologic response. Formally, it's called the amygdala capture. And so the amygdala sits at the base of your spine, and it's always scanning what you're doing. And if it feels you're in danger, it takes over all of your system and floods it with adrenaline and gets you ready to engage on a physical level. Well, that's not very useful for most of our conflicts, because then what it does is it drives the next level, which is we'll have an emotional response driven by that physical response, which oftentimes comes out as anger or frustration or shutting down. And these aren't conducive to dialogue. But at some point, sometimes, even somebody you really deeply disagree with will make a really good point, or will ask you an interesting question, or will listen to you or compliment you, and it shifts, and suddenly you're connecting at this mental level where you're actually ready to engage, put your guard down a little bit, and engage in a way that you might be asking questions rather than trying to protect yourself from the discomfort. And if you're very brave, you may go to the next level, which is trying to think about a spiritual connection that you might have. And so one of the things that we learn to do is use those tools of reflection, of self-reflection, of mindfulness, to be able to help that process move through your body, so that when you get that physical discomfort, instead of letting it drive you, you stop and you use it as a flag to pay attention. Something's going on, pay attention, and go into listening mode. So we say you stop, you breathe, you listen. That gets you to the emotional level, where you can ask yourself what emotion is most useful in this moment. And then to move up, you can ask yourself a question like, what can I learn in this moment, which brings you up to the mental level? Or if you're exceedingly brave, what do I share with this person, which can bring you up to the spiritual level? So these 4 levels you hear about over and over. Certainly you may recognize them from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In the 1950s, he's a psychologist who talked about these different basic needs that we all have, and that they happen in order. That somebody who's desperately hungry can't think about self-actualization. So it's a process that needs to work itself in order. Of course, given the 21st century, and certainly with COVID, our basic human needs have changed drastically to really think about Wi-Fi before almost anything else. So the roots of Maslow's hierarchy, though, go much, much further back than the 1950s. I know them from the Hebrew Bible. When Moses went out Mount Sinai, they talk about him moving through 4 levels of holiness. He's at the base of the mountain with all the people of Israel, the physical manifestation of holiness. Then only he and 70 of the elders and priests move partway up, and they have a big feast evoking emotional glory. And then only he moves up, and at the summit, receives, in a moment of mental clarity, receives reality as manifested in the Torah. And then the cloud itself on the top of the mountain is the fourth level. And then when the temple was built in Jerusalem, it was built literally as a guided meditation from outward to inner chambers along these four worlds. And when the temple was destroyed and the Hebrew prayer service was crafted, again, it was crafted quite literally as a guided meditation through the four levels. We also find it in Hinduism and in Vishnu's four totems: the mace, the physical strength, the lotus flower representing the glory of existence, the discus is here at the mind chakra, and then this the conch shell makes this Om sound, which has been referred to as a primeval sound of all creation. And they say that it's in the quiet after the M where the work gets done. So it's everywhere in Buddhism. Certainly Angkor Wat, those who have been there, built first as a Hindu construct and then became Buddhist. And again, from outer to inner and upward. But if you look in Buddhism from the Buddha's four sites, one at each of the four levels, there's a meditation called Anapanasati that, according to some tradition, the Buddha went through when he was enlightened, that moves right through each of the four. And then there are four jhanas, four levels of transcendence that mirror these precise four levels. Any of the Christian churches in Europe will show you the four levels again, from lower to upper. Here you see Adam and Eve representing the mind chakra. Oftentimes there are four elements, each one protected by an archangel. Of course, medieval Europe, all archangels were old and white. So thanks to Disney, we now have new models that we can draft to incorporate some diversity. Thanks to Natalia for pointing out the relationship between Maslow and the Blackfoot nation. This is a medicine wheel that was gifted to me from Shoshone Bannock and Ogallala Lakota traditions. And so each of these traditions teach us something else about the four worlds. And the American indigenous models often are circular, reminding us that this is about balance. It's not that one's better, but rather that it's about keeping balance to all of our basic needs. And the circle uses that. In Islam, we learn about, as we go deeper, the differences between us start to dissipate. And so we talk about Sharia, which defines what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. The Tarika, prayer of the heart, defines what's yours is mine, what's mine is yours. Hakika, up here at the level of truth, reminds us there is no mine and there is no yours. And then by the time you get to attunement, there is no me and there is no you, that at some fundamental level, we're all connected. And then the Latin America shamanic totems describe the energy at different levels, from the serpent on the ground all the way up to the eagle. And you'll see this represented in the chakras as well. So what does this mean for water? It's interesting. There's a lot of great work to dialogue across cultures and across constructs, but it's important when we're talking about water to remember, for example, we're really conflating four different waters. So there's the physical water that we see, that we touch, that we move. There's mental water that we calculate. We calculate price or crop per drop. But there's also emotional water, water tied to power, water tied to sovereignty, water tied to history, and of course, spiritual water, where all of our faith traditions tap into water for spiritual transcendence. And again, because of this Enlightenment rift, oftentimes our negotiations are around the things that we can calculate. They're around physical and mental water, when in fact, the roots of the conflict or the issues that most need addressing are emotional or spiritual waters that may not even come up in discussion, because in the West, we've lost the language to touch on them. Let me just give a couple of examples of how we might use these constructs. If we think about our four basic needs as kind of a ladder or a circle, as we move around them or reorient ourselves, we can find ways to problem solve in negotiation. So one lesson is, if you get stuck on a problem, make it bigger. For years, the Nile was looked at as the solution to the Nile was purely technical. Starting in the 60s, the feeling was if there was enough data, or if there was an accurate enough model, everybody would see the benefits of cooperation and simply would, until they started to negotiate a treaty. And that treaty got held up literally on 3 words, where all the upstream countries wanted to talk about there would be no significant effect, or you wouldn't significantly affect the water security of any other Nile Basin state. But Egypt and Sudan wanted not to adversely affect the water security and current uses and rights. So that right there represents all of the emotional water in 3 words, representing the Egyptian vulnerability and the concern about 11 countries upstream. And of course, the upstream countries being concerned that that may foreclose their development. So even though they had spent 40 years dodging the politics and the emotional aspects, you couldn't be. But what if we raise the level of discourse? Once the dam, the Grand Renaissance Dam, started to be constructed in Ethiopia, the sides were just simply locked in. And if you just focus on the dam and you just focus on the Blue Nile, it's really hard to find movement. But if you zoom out a little bit and ask, well, are there efficiencies that we can affect on the White Nile that may allow some less concern downstream to allow some development on the Blue Nile? Or even bigger, if we move out and think about larger issues, not just of hydropower, but more generally about a basket of benefits of roads and trade and agriculture and power, and can we develop a basket of benefits where the dam itself is only a small part, but the basket is big enough and robust enough that everybody can find gain. The opposite is also true. Sometimes we want to get deep into the woods of what the issue actually is and find their room to move. So here the lesson is to look for nuance. So here we'll go here to the confluence of the Yarmouk and the Jordan. And when Israel and Jordan started to negotiate peace, there was a strip of land where the border had drifted, if you will, into Israeli territory. And Israel had been farming this little strip for 20 years. And of course, Jordan wanted it back. And at one level, this is intractable. 2 sides want the same strip of land, but let's nuance it a little bit. What actually does each side want? Well, Israel wants to continue farming. That's the basic activity that they're looking to continue to do. They've been doing it for 20 years. Jordan doesn't care about farming. They want sovereignty. And so now the question is, can you construct an agreement where one side gets sovereignty and the other side continues to farm? And the answer is yes. Sovereignty went back to Jordan. You see Jordan flying its flag there above the little strip of land. And then Jordan leased the land back to Israel for 25 years. And that way, the sovereignty was recognized, and instead of being a power grab, it was the opposite. It was Jordan's benevolence that allowed Israel to continue to farm. Last year, the land went back to full sovereignty and full access to Jordan, and it made barely a ripple because it was not quite as sensitive. This idea of reframing is something important that we do. Again, we're reorienting our view of a dispute. A lot of you have trained in conflict, and you see pictures like this. Is this a young woman or an old woman? And the answer is yes, it's both. And so often when we're faced with a question, is it farms or the environment? The answer is yes. We reorient the question. How do we encourage farming? How do we protect farmers and their livelihoods while protecting the environment. Is it upstream or downstream? The answer is yes. How do you allow for upstream countries to develop while protecting the vulnerability of the downstream countries? And finally, I want to end on this level. When I think about the Enlightenment, it's only been 200 years, and it's only been in North America and Europe, although it's the constructs that come out of it have spread now around the world. But most of the world is very comfortable dealing with all four levels together, all four worlds together. And so recognizing that it may not be so useful for us to exclude anything religious or spiritual in our conversations. And it's time now to heal the Enlightenment rift and think about how the four worlds can come together. And one of the ways we're doing this is giving legal protection or legal personhood to rivers. It was done in New Zealand and in India with indigenous peoples representing the river itself. Simply remembering that people of faith are legitimate stakeholders in the room and oftentimes can be a bridge across communities or can help elevate the conversation beyond the purely technical, even sometimes literally, recognizing there are big Christian populations in both Egypt and Ethiopia. They've been tapped as mediators. But just listen when we're thinking about water purely as a technical resource, what it is that we lose. Here in New Zealand, the water authority tapped into Maori expertise and experience, and just listen to how this feels different. This is the introduction to the management plan in 2014. All things in the natural world have a life force and a spiritual dimension. Respect for the spiritual integrity of the environment and the God that created it will ensure that the treasure can be protected and passed on to succeeding generations. You can just hear how the conversation is elevated and challenges us to think about water as a resource that has many different sets of meanings and values. So these are just a touch. The book itself talks about, again, it's a how-to manual from the things that I learned that I find useful, are rethinking how we sit together, rethinking how to listen, not just with our ears, but learning to listen from our heart, the deep listening, the transformative listening, learning to let go of ownership of ideas. And so if you are interested, the book is there. There's even a code for a discount if you go to Island Press, but I'm certainly welcome any questions or comments that anybody has. And thank you all for your patience.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for this wonderful talk. So in the meanwhile, you have been receiving greetings from literally all over the world, from Cyprus, Kenya, Austria, Niger, Nepal, Palestine, Sri Lanka, India, South Africa, Myanmar, Tanzania, Iran, Venezuela, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Mongolia, Netherlands, Italy, Argentina, Tunisia, Afghanistan, and the United States, just to mention some of the corners from which our participants are joining the conversation. And we have a number of really interesting questions and answers. So I will start with a question from Pablo, who is asking, as far as moments of transformation in water-related conflicts go, where do you see the most promising leverage points for advancing fair and long-lasting resolutions?
Oh gosh, I think if I think about the trajectory of water management, I think we're moving in a direction of inclusion of more values. I mean, certainly when I started as a scientist, it was all technical. It was all, how do you develop? I remember a professor saying the first thing you need to do with a river is get rid of all those pesky meanders because they're inefficient. You want a nice straight river. And I think increasingly, certainly we've recognized the importance of sustainability, thinking about future generations. I think we've thought about the value of water well beyond the utilitarian. I do think in some pockets of the development community, certainly they're becoming attuned to listening to these kind of non-Western approaches to water. So if I'm thinking about a trajectory, I tend to be mostly optimistic. But as ever, the biggest threat to water development is simply a lack of money and political will.
Interesting. Thank you. Luciana is asking how to deal with the different cultural and behavioral aspects when you're conducting a negotiation on water issues.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point. I think a lot of folks, especially in the West, aren't used to hearing these kinds of concepts, and certainly issues of religion and faith can be very divisive in the West. And so I'm always very careful how I would introduce it, but whether you're explicit or not, the tools work. And so if you learn to work well, one of the things that you can practice is if somebody's angry, somebody that you love is angry, if you sit next to them and you match their breathing, you can actually help their breathing slow down. Your breathing will slow down and their breathing will slow down. And it just works. You don't have to say, oh, this is a Buddhist meditation technique that I got from the forest community in Thailand. It just works. And if anybody's interested in the roots, certainly you can draw on Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. That discourse is very comfortable within Western discourse. So where and how to introduce explicitly and naming the faith traditions or the indigenous approaches, I think the questioner is right. You have to be careful because it may do more harm than good.
Thank you. Larry is asking, Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall speaks of the need for two-eyed seeing, linking Western science to indigenous ways of knowing. But Larry says, it seems to me, though, that the most powerful actors have no respect for non-scientific approaches to water management. Are there any examples that challenge this point of view?
Wow. Well, first of all, hi, Larry. Good to see you here, at least digitally. It's been too long. I mean, you're involved in the same kind of conversations that I am. I think if you look at certainly the development community, if you look at the people who are funding water resources development in the developing world, if you look at the Northern European development partners, if you look at the World Bank or the regional development banks, they're all incorporating the non-scientific approach. They simply are. Maybe they started with an environmental impact assessment. Then they started to include social impact assessment. And once you're doing social impacts, you have to really talk about the values of the community, which will incorporate this. And I think, I believe those of us in education, certainly again in the West, it behooves us to really go out and try and figure out how to relearn how to have these conversations. Because I think you're right. There's a lot of people of the, just build it and people be damned generation. But I think that's giving way to more of a concern for long-term, both environmental and social impacts.
Thanks. Another very interesting question from Sophia, and she's asking, what would you consider are the limits of conflict resolution approaches in regards to justice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, anybody, I see a lot of names here, people I recognize as facilitators and people who are involved in disputes. Anybody will tell you the biggest limitation is time and money. To really have these conversations, if you look at the more famous water agreements, they've all taken 10 or 20 or 30 years to negotiate. And often I've been in a room where somebody said, yeah, you have 2.5 days to work this issue out. And it just getting on the same page, just learning to speak the same language, learning to see through each other's worldviews can take so long. So I think it's pay, and the money oftentimes is coming from people with very tight funding deadlines, that they need metrics, they need progress within the year. And so learning how to fund these types of processes, recognizing that they'll take years or even decades, is one of the biggest challenges.
So I'll take advantage of my position and ask a question on the lines of Sophia. And there is an interesting literature that is looking at environmental conflicts as forces for sustainability, that relates to the work of political ecologists following Joan Martinez Salier in Barcelona and the EJ Atlas environmental conflicts group. So if conflicts can be understood as forces for sustainability, then conflict, what is the role of conflict resolution in terms of power dynamics?
Oof. How much time do we have? Okay, one of the tricks is, one of the challenges as a facilitator is you really are there to facilitate and not to advocate. If you find yourself advocating, you won't be a very good facilitator, which then leaves the question, if you're a believer in justice, how do you incorporate movement towards restorative justice or sustainable justice, while not drifting into the role of advocate? And I think that's really tough. It's something that's always, we walk a very fine line. Having said that, I think I'll just give you one simple tool, is on the front end of a dialogue, if you ask what are our goals for an agreement, oftentimes one of the goals of an agreement is something called sustainability. And if we break it out into let's say 3, or I would prefer 4 aspects of sustainability, then at the end, we can ask whether the agreement meets that. And one of the metrics for sustainability will be, is it just? And so that helps us come back to the metric that we've set on the front end to have the conversation around justice, even though nominally the facilitator is not advocating for one side or another.
Paula is still insisting on this point, which I find very interesting, and she's asking about, does accounting for spirituality of water allows to deal with power asymmetries, and if yes, how?
Yeah, so I guess there's such a wonderful literature that's built up in the last 10 or 15 years. Certainly, you guys had Mark Zaitoon, who's one of my personal heroes. He and Naho and Jeroen. You had Jeroen also, and Margriet. I mean, you have all these wonderful folks who are really thinking about power in lots of ways. And I get stuck because I think what I learned from this literature and from these wonderful practitioners is how to identify power imbalance, but not necessarily how to do something about it. And I'm if nothing else a practitioner, and again my role is in the room facilitating dialogue and trying to help a dialogue move organically towards a just resolution. But there's, in a lot of ways, there's just simply nothing to be done. The power relations that exist outside of the room also exist within the room, and that's exhibited as money, or it's exhibited as certain countries are more powerful than others. And there also is, I think, an organic reorganization that can happen in basins. The Mekong, I think, is wonderful. The 4 lower countries have really done a remarkable job of balancing their collective power with China upstream. And some have even suggested that it's actually better that China not be part of the Mekong River secretary, precisely because of that, precisely because of power imbalance, that they should work together as closely as possible. And I think that's true. Certainly the upstream countries on the Nile collectively were able to balance the power downstream of Sudan and Egypt. So I know I'm not giving a direct answer because I don't have one. I think all of us being aware of this and thinking about how to advocate for justice is important. And I don't know what to do except all of us do our best within our own little worlds.
Thank you. There is another very interesting question from, there are so many questions here actually that we will share with you, and hopefully you can answer some of those in the future, and we will share the materials. But in the meanwhile, there's an anonymous participant who's asking, how can spirituality be integrated into hydropolitics, while we also talk about the tendency towards homogenization, desire to control, as well as hegemonic knowledge building?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the power conversation. Again, I think my sense is once you're talking about sustainability, you're also talking about justice. And once you're talking about justice, you're talking about justice for giving voice to the voiceless. And once you're doing that, there are easy methods to incorporate those voices into dialogue on water. And again, I think I gave a couple of examples there at the end by simply recognizing the personhood of a river and giving the river explicit representation. Is a very natural way to do that. If a river is able to represent itself in dialogue and can object if it doesn't like something that's happening to it, you're already moving forward. Sometimes there are legal protections. The indigenous tribes in the US, their treaties are increasingly being recognized as documents of international law. And so as we negotiate the Columbia Basin, it's not just the US and Canada, but it's the 15 US tribes and an equal number of First Nations in Canada that are legally represented as participants to the dialogue. So I think there are really good models for how both the values and the people can be better represented in these processes.
Thanks. We are running out of time, but it's difficult to resist to continue asking these questions. So I'll ask the last two. One is from Alejandra, and she's asking, what kind of facilitation moderation techniques do you use today? And what kind of facilitation and moderation training do you recommend for young water professionals who will be working in cross-cultural cooperation and aid settings?
Oh gosh, well, read my book. I would be derelict if I didn't mention that, because it really goes to the first part of the question. These are what I tried to do, is integrate the kind of Western approaches that I've learned with these tools and constructs that I've been learning from faith traditions and from indigenous communities. And so it's pretty much listed there how. And you reference the U theory, and I think that's right. I think we go deep and then we come out of it transformed on the other side. I think it's a good model, and I certainly reference it in the book. And in the book, I tried also to reference all the sources that I used. So if you're interested in more, I don't know, Alejandra, I don't know where you're based, but if you're interested in more, there should be resources for you. In terms of the training, I think any training in dispute resolution is useful. Personally, I think the dispute resolution training or dispute transformation training that's geared towards water is especially useful. I personally believe water is really a unique resource, and the tools that we use are unique to the world. So if you're in Europe, IHE Delft is an amazing place. Again, Mark Zeitoun teaches water security at East Anglia. I know there are a couple of really good places to find it. And certainly I offer a 1-week course both in Delft in the spring and here in Oregon in the summer, which is also offered entirely online, that follows the book as a model. So it's out there. And I think everybody who's working in water ought to also be trained in transforming conflicts.
Thanks so much. We can continue this conversation about the trainings with NEWAVE, and of course we would love to develop also in this direction with you. So maybe the final question, considering the time, and it comes from an anonymous participant, and the question is, in your research around the world, was there a surprising lesson related to conflict resolution that you found was common among all or most of the faith traditions and knowledges that you engaged with?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is these what I've come to know as the four worlds. This feels extremely universal. I've found it described in I mean, you heard the first part of my talk was about 8 or so different traditions where it's fundamental, and it's just so universal, and it works so well that I can't help but think there's something something profound and useful in its construct. The idea that we see the world at any given time through 4 prisms or 4 lenses, and I've come to use it really as a checklist. If I'm designing a process, I'll simply go through the list. What are the physical needs of the people in the room? Is there air? Is there light? Is there food? Will we have breaks? What are the emotional needs of the people in the room? Everybody comes in to want to talk, which doesn't leave anybody to listen. Everybody wants to be listened to, but nobody wants to listen. So how do we reorient the dialogue in a way that gives people the opportunity both to vent and to listen? And then the mental aspect, how do we learn from each other? Once we have vented, how do we learn? And whether we name it or not, there are spiritual needs of the people in the room, and we either could name it or not, depending. So I think that's probably one of the most surprising universal constructs I've found. And then the energy work. I mean, if you know, if you're talking about grace in Christianity, or chi, or ki, or ruach, or any of a number of different ways of representing energetic work, that's something that also feels very universal, and something that's profoundly useful in a room where oftentimes I feel that's what I'm doing, is I'm molding energy rather than helping people see things in a different view.
Well, thank you so much, Aaron. You definitely mold some energy here with this this final talk, and I really want to thank you from my heart, and I also want to thank all of our participants, all of the speakers of the series. I want to thank the different NEWAVE supervisors that were involved in the design of this e-lecture series, including Margriet Zwartewien, Maria Kaika, Michelle Coy, Dave Hatema, Rutger Bollens, and many more. I want to deeply thank Caterina Marinetti, which has done an amazing, enormous organizational and coordination work for this theoretical series. I want to thank Barbara Keeling, who's been working in communication and dissemination of all of our events, and all of our network management committee members, and the organizational members, the hosts, and the beneficiaries and the partners of NEWAVE, which I will not list here because we are a large group. And then finally, I'm very happy to acknowledge that the NEWAVE project has been receiving funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program under the Marie Sklodowska-Curie grant. So today with this, we are concluding this theoretical perspectives series, and we will start again in 2021 with some other exciting online activities. So to all of our participants, stay tuned, stay connected through our social media and through our newsletter. We will communicate in advance the activities that the NEWAVE is organizing. Thank you so much, and hope to engage with all of you very soon.